Welcome, everyone, to the webinar today. Good afternoon. My name is Leslie Schmerler, and I am the director of the New York Foundling's Vincent J. Fontana Center for Child Protection. I would like to welcome everyone to the sixth and the last webinar in the APSAC Fontana Center 2020 webinar series. This webinar is titled Interviewing the Child Who is Recanting Sexual Abuse with Dr. Thomas Lyon. This webinar will be recorded and the PowerPoint will be emailed to everyone after the webinar. There will be time for questions at the end, so please write your questions in the chat or the Q&A sections and we will get to those at the end. Before we begin, I would like to introduce, and before I introduce Dr. Thomas Lyon, I would like to first introduce Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, who is the Executive Director of APSAC, and she will talk to you a little bit more about APSAC and some exciting opportunities APSAC has coming up. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank all of you for being with us today. On behalf of APSAC President Stacy LeBlanc and all of our board and staff, thank you to the New York Foundling for co-sponsoring this event, and thank you, Dr. Lyon, and welcome to all of you for spending an hour of your day with us today. We're so thrilled that so many of you registered for this event and want to make sure you know of some other opportunities we have coming up for you in the very near future. Our NCA-approved 4-day forensic interview training will start again in early December. There are only 10 slots left. It sold out very quickly last time. So if you're looking for forensic interview training, please go to www.apsac.org and click on training and learn a little bit more about that. We're really got great reviews from our first virtual event. It will be featuring Patty Toth and Julie Keniston and other staff as well. We are really proud to announce that we're kicking off a certificate program on eliminating systemic racism in child welfare. The first lectures will be offered as a 3-hour event, two lectures back-to-back, featuring 2 wonderful speakers. Their names are on the screen, Debengshu Roy Gardner and Denise Shrevington. You can also register for that at apsac.org, and I think Leslie's going to be putting out some links in the chat box. We're really excited about this. It'll be an 8-lecture series to earn a certificate. Our online course is bringing in hundreds of people. It's a wonderful resource for people that are looking for new experiences for staff in service training while we're all working remotely. And it's a great resource for any of us that are teaching remotely. There's wonderful content we can use in our classes. There are all kinds of group and student discounts available. And so we encourage you to take advantage of that as well. On a fun note, please consider joining us for our inaugural APSAC NEK, 1K, 5K, 10K, whatever you can do. It's going to be a virtual run walk, raising funds to help acknowledge local champions for children. It's a new initiative where we can have a good time, get some exercise, raise some funds for APSAC, and again, help us acknowledge champions for kids. And in taking a moment, kind of think of this as the NPR pledge break moment. APSAC has had our challenges thanks to COVID-19 this year. And we know that if each person on this webinar made a $5 or $10 donation, we would come really close to meeting our fundraising goal for 2020. If you're not an APSAC member, or even if you are an APSAC member and you'd like to show your appreciation for the events that we've been bringing without cost pretty much all year, this would be a great time to help us get through the end of the year by making a micro donation at the APSAC website. So thank you for all that you do to support APSAC. Thank you for all that you do to support kids and families in your community. And it's now my pleasure to turn this back to Leslie.
Thank you, Janet. So before we begin, I'd like to quickly introduce Dr. Thomas Lyon, who is the Judge Edward J. and Rui L. Guardo Chair of Law and Psychology at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. His research examines the best means by which child witnesses can be questioned in order to maximize their productivity and minimize error. His work has been supported by the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you, Dr. Lyon. You can begin now.
All right, thanks for that nice introduction, and hello, everybody. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research on reluctance and recantation among children. And I'm going to emphasize how there's good evidence that the reason why children will become so reluctant that they may recant their sexual abuse allegation is because of family pressures. And I'll talk about a couple of studies that we've done. My experience is in dependency court. So I actually started out there as an attorney, and now I've returned there for the research that I do. And we routinely will question children, interview children for the dependency courts in Los Angeles who have alleged sex abuse. And because these are cases where the state has to intervene on behalf of the child because of some unprotectiveness, typically on the part of the parent, we see a lot of recantations. And so we have a lot of experience with it. And that experience has both led to our research and to the hints that I'm going to give you about interviewing recanting children today. So family pressures is going to be a very important factor in understanding recantation. I'm going to emphasize, and this is probably preaching to the choir, is how important it is that at the very earliest moment when a child discloses abuse, that we conduct a complete, detailed, videotaped interview, because the best, you might say, the best bulwark against recantations is a very well documented and original disclosure. Because if the child discloses in a very convincing and complete way early on, it doesn't matter if the child recants. That won't undermine the case. But of course, I think you all already appreciate that need. I'm then going to give you advice if it isn't a case where the child has recanted before coming to you, or rather, it's a case where you're interviewing the child who is actively recanting. What should you do? This puzzled us for a number of years when we first started working on this issue. But I now feel pretty confident that we do a good job. And as I mentioned, we interview quite a large number of children. One of the studies I'm going to describe, there were over 50 kids who recanted abuse who we looked at. And over the past few years, I'd say we've probably interviewed at least 30 children who have recanted. And here's my advice. The advice is going to be, and I'll spell this out more completely and give you examples of how this works, is that you treat the prior disclosure as the event, right? Under normal circumstance, you treat the abuse that the child has experienced as the event. But in a case of recantation, the child is saying there was no abuse. Well, the next step then is say, okay, so the event is the child's disclosure. And so rather than ask the child to tell you everything about what happened, since they're going to tell you nothing happened, you're going to ask the child to describe in as much detail as they will provide what disclosures they've made in the past, because those prior disclosures will be the basis upon which you can decide, is the recantation true? That is the child now telling the truth, or is the recantation false? In other words, was the child really abused? I'm also going to recommend, and this is based on the research that shows that family pressures are the reason why kids recant, is to ask about interactions with the family members. These are the kinds of questions we ask in any abuse case. We ask, what has your mom said to you about the abuse? What has the alleged perpetrator said to you about the abuse? But these questions are going to be important in recantations for a different reason, right? Rather than look at whether the child might have been coached to make a false allegation, or whether the parents are being supportive in a case where the child does allege abuse. We want to find out if the parent's lack of support might be the reason why the child is recanting abuse, or if the parent has fed some information to the child that has led the child to change their story. And again, I'm going to give you some examples of that from our own casework. And then finally, I'm going to recommend desires and feelings. Children who are recanting are remarkably upfront about basically their reason for recanting. Now, of course, they won't describe it that way. They won't say, well, the reason why I'm now lying about being abused. They'll say, the reason why I'm coming clean, or the reason why I'm now telling the truth. But then they'll explain to you many of the same factors that you get through asking the questions about family pressures. They'll talk about the need to be back with the family. They'll talk about their need to restore the relationship. Something that we've noticed recently, and this is something that we're now going to try to study more systematically, is a very common thing that we hear is from older girls who are the stepchildren of men who have fathered other children with the mother. And those girls will often tell us that they don't want their younger sibs to grow up without a father, because they know what it's like to grow up without a father, right? And it's just this heartbreaking explanation. But recanters will be very upfront about it. And what their explanation then allows a dependency judge to do, or anyone who's listening to the interview to do, is to understand the pressures that are put on children and understand why the child might now be recanting what is a true allegation of abuse. Okay, so let me talk a little bit, and this is kind of the less interesting part of the talk, because it's more the statistics and the numbers, and then I'll give you the actual case studies a little bit later. But I do want to talk about how we think about non-disclosure and recantation, because, and as I'll mention in a moment, there's a lot of case law now being produced where experts who come into court and explain to juries why children deny abuse are being challenged as being unscientific. And I think it's really a misunderstanding of the research. And so I want to talk to you about what the research suggests about non-disclosure and recantation. Now, this is something that everybody acknowledges, even the people who are skeptical of what is called child sexual abuse accommodation, and that's the London folks who have written reviews on this literature. Even the people skeptical of whether there are special dynamics of disclosure and non-disclosure acknowledge that if you ask adult surveyors, that is adult survey respondents, whether they were ever sexually abused, and then you ask those who are willing to tell the surveyor, yes, I was abused as a child, if they ever told anyone, they will more often than not say they never disclosed as a child. So we know that most abuse is not disclosed by children while they're children. Okay, so most abuse is undiscovered, undisclosed. We also know, and I'll explain why I cite this kind of weird group of kids in a minute. We also know that if you look at a select group of children, if you look at children who nobody suspected was abused, who nobody questioned about abuse, where the child didn't make any kind of sudden outcry, but the child came up with this symptom that then led the parents to take the child in and get the child medically checked, and then discovered that the child clearly had been sexually abused because the child had a highly diagnostic sexually transmittable disease. We find that those kids, when initially asked, will usually deny abuse. Okay. Now, why would I focus on this very tiny group of kids? Well, what this illustrates is that if you were to take a representative sexually abused child, right? If you were to pluck one of those children who is never told, who no one has ever suspected was abused, if you were to pluck them out of the population and you were to say to them, were you ever abused? They're likely to deny it. And that's the reason why experts should be and are telling juries that most kids, at least many kids, will deny abuse when first questioned about abuse. At the same time, that if you look at the studies that just look at the kids coming to clinics for suspected sex abuse, you find very, very high rates of disclosure. The reason why you see this very low rate of disclosure among these very select group of kids, but very high rates of disclosure among the studies that just say, what percentage of kids seen by clinics who question children about abuse disclose, is because most disclosure is suspected, and most abuse is suspected, and most abuse is substantiated through disclosure, right? We don't see the iceberg. We only know about the tip of the iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg are the children who come up above the surface and disclose abuse. What that means then is that means that there is a huge pool of children who are going to deny abuse, and that when children do disclose abuse, they're not typical kids. they're unusually willing to disclose abuse. But those children are also susceptible to basically going back down under the surface. They're the part of the iceberg that is quite likely to go back under the water if we don't interview them effectively and if we don't provide them support. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the statistics on recantation. So one of the things that we've been able to do, because as I mentioned, we deal with dependency court and we've worked with them for years, is we were able to look at several years of sex abuse allegations, and we were able to take a random group of these kids, and random is a good thing in research because it means it's a representative sample. So we took 257 kids, and what we found is that about a fourth of those children recanted their abuse at some point. Now, 23% is not more than half, but remember, these are children who did disclose their abuse sufficiently for their abuse to be substantiated by a social services worker or by the police. And as you'll see, the key is to not ask, well, what percentage of kids recant, but are those kids likely to be recanting true abuse or false abuse? And I'm going to get to that. So we know that a substantial percentage of kids will not disclose when questioned. We know that a substantial percentage of kids, even if they do disclose, are likely to recant. And because of this issue that we can't say for sure a child was abused unless they tell us they were abused, what this means is that even this 23%, which is a lot, is underestimated, right? Because recantations so often take kids out of the system. There's so many cases where children recant at such an early phase, they're already recanting by the time the emergency response worker shows up. They're already recanting by the time the police question the child. And those cases, in most situations, are lost to the system. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you and helped you understand why it is that we deal with an unusually forthcoming group of kids when we work in the system, because the system depends on children to disclose in order to be suspected of abuse. We depend on children disclosing in order to substantiate abuse, but most kids are underwater. Most kids are not disclosing, and even if they do come above the water and disclose, they are very likely to go back down again unless we treat them effectively. So what factors increase the likelihood that a child will come forward, but then will ultimately recant? And this is a study, as I mentioned, that we did, it's been 13 years already. And as I already mentioned, this is 257 children, substantiated cases in the Los Angeles County Dependency Court. Here's what we found. We found that these factors increase the likelihood of recantation. If the child was under 10, now I think everybody would guess, and other studies have found, that younger kids are more likely to recant. What I think is particularly interesting is that it's not the very young kids who are most likely to recant. It's actually the children that are just a little under 10, like 8, 9, 10 years of age. And the way to think about this is to recognize that these are kids who aren't quite adolescents. They haven't quite developed a preference for peers over parents. They're still heavily ensconced in the family, right? Because this is all going to be about family pressures. Because the second factor that increased recantation was if the mother was unsupportive. Now, how do we define supportiveness? Well, it's pretty easy to do in dependency court because the worker says to the mom, do you believe her when she says she was abused, or him? And if the mother says no, that's considered unsupportive. We also looked at other kinds of unsupportiveness. A horrible example is the mother, forced the child to come with her when she visited the perpetrator in jail. Those are unsupportive things. And if the mother was unsupportive, children were more than twice as likely to recant their allegations. And the last thing that we found was if the child made an accusation against a father figure. And again, think family pressures, right? You can understand recantation when you have a child who isn't old enough to be able to look outside of her family for support, so a child under 10, whose mother says, I don't believe you, or does things to suggest to the child that she isn't believed. And the person who the child is accusing is someone who is both extremely close to the child, but also extremely close to the mother. the person who can potentially support the child's allegation. And when you take those three things and you add them up, in those cases, you can say that more likely than not, a child will recant. But as I've emphasized before, even if it's 23%, even if it's less than 50%, it still suggests that recantation is a huge problem. Now, an interesting problem with recantation, of course, is, as I mentioned before, it makes it harder to substantiate. And part of the reason for that is because it is possible for a recantation to be a true recantation. In other words, it's possible for a child who originally made a false allegation to recant and now tell the truth. How do you determine that? Well, here's the way we thought about it. We said, okay, if recantations are really a signal that the allegation is false, then the rate of recantation should go up or down depending on whether there's other evidence of abuse, right? If there's other evidence of abuse, we can be more confident that the child was really abused. And if recants are a sign that the abuse didn't really happen, then the recantation rate should be lower in cases where there is other evidence of abuse. And we didn't find that, okay? Recantation rates were not lower when there was other evidence of abuse, which should be the case if many recantations are false allegations. We found no evidence that recantations were a sign that abuse didn't really occur. We also looked at cases that might be considered a custody battle. Now, of course, perpetrators are motivated to call everything a custody battle because that's one of the few motivations they can point to that might increase false allegations. But we just liberally said, okay, if they say it's a custody battle, we'll call it a custody battle. And then we looked at the recantation rate among those cases, and we didn't find any difference. Now, ironically, you actually wouldn't expect to see a high rate of recantation among custody battles because those are cases where the other parent is extremely supportive of the allegation, right? And what we're looking at are cases where the parents are unsupportive, and that helps to explain why a child is recanting what is a true allegation of abuse. Okay, now I'll tell you about one more paper, and then I want to get to our case studies. This is a paper that we did where we took those 50-some children who had recanted in a previous study, and then we figured out how to look even more closely at the factors that might increase recantation. Did that is we matched them with 57 cases from the same group who had not recanted, right? And we matched them on those circumstances that we already know increase recant. So we matched them for maternal supportiveness, for accusations against a father figure for kids under 10. And basically when you match, what you're able to do is you're able to say, okay, with even more precision, now that they're matched on those characteristics, to the extent that there's still some difference between the recanters and the non-recanters, it gives us an even clearer idea of some of the more subtle things that might increase recantation. And here's what we found. Recantation was higher when other members of the family expressed disbelief. And this is something, as soon as you find something and then you start noticing it, we see again and again that whether the siblings believe the child, that will influence the likelihood that the child will recant. Whether an uncle or an aunt believes the child. We found that if visitation was suspect, with the suspect was recommended, that increased recant. Now, we couldn't determine exactly how often the child had seen the suspect or the alleged perp, but this is a good proxy for that. And what this suggests is that if the child is subject to repeated exposure to the perpetrator, they're more likely to recant. And the really interesting thing, because people usually think the opposite, is that if the child had remained in the home, the child was more likely to recant. Now, usually people say, oh, kids recant because they don't like to be in foster care. And that's true. Kids will very verbally, adamantly object to the fact that they've been placed in foster care. But what this fact suggests is that it's true that they're happier being in the home, but notice the family pressure issue. they're certainly more subject to family pressures if they remain in the home. Now, I don't want you to be excited about removing kids from the home because you want to prevent recantations. And so I should add that, that this factor didn't matter if one controlled for the other factors. What that means is that, you know, if we did a univariate analysis, then foster care mattered, but if we did this multivariate analysis, that it didn't matter. And the bottom line is, what this fact means is that it depends on whether the child is subject to a lot of pressures. If the child is subject to a lot of pressures, then remaining in the home is going to make the child more susceptible to those pressures, right? I think ultimately these findings are nonsensical. Okay, let me say just a word about expert testimony, because this has come up within the last few years. This is this big issue. APSAC got involved. We wrote an amicus brief. I tried to help out. I didn't do a very good job, or at least I wasn't very successful, in a case that came up in the New Jersey Supreme Court within the last few years. The good news is more than 40 states allow experts to testify in cases where children recant or deny abuse. And they testify about something that I'm sure you've heard of called child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Now, there are problems with the syndrome. The fact that it's called a syndrome is unfortunate. And even Roland Summit, who created the syndrome, said as much 10 years after he came up with the term. But the basis for the testimony is quite sound, because the basis for it is that experts will testify on behalf of the prosecution. They won't make a comment about the individual child's credibility, but they will be able to tell the jury about the dynamics of abuse disclosure. They'll be able to talk about the closeness of the child to the perpetrator and how that leads to delays. They'll be able to talk about how when the child is first questioned about abuse, the child is likely to deny abuse. And of course, an extreme form of denial is where the child does at some point disclose, but then denies later. And that's what we call a recantation. Well, more than 40 states allow this, but, and this is why I'm talking about this, is within the last 2 years, the New Jersey Supreme Court has disapproved of this. And this was a case that I participated in, APSAC participated in, but we just weren't able to convince the court to override the opinion of a group of experts who say that denial is just not common in sex abuse. Fortunately, thus far, lower courts have rejected what's called JLG. That's New Jersey versus JLG. In my home state, California, in Missouri. The problem, though, is that state Supreme Courts have not considered this. And part of the reason these lower courts don't want to reverse is because they're bound by their state Supreme Court. So if you are involved in a case and there is a challenge, and if you're an expert witness, I can guarantee someone's going to cite JLG at some point. Definitely, I know if you're in New York, the New York courts have already been flooded with these issues, with these challenges to expert testimony. Then I want to give you a little plug for a piece that I just got accepted in behavioral sciences and the law, which will help to address the issue that experts have now argued that there's no support for accommodation, and they base it on their review of research that I argue is highly flawed. Okay. But back to our focus, which is, well, what do you do if you have a child in front of you who is recanting? Well, all of these factors suggest that family pressures contribute to recantation. Younger kids are closer to their family. They're less likely to have peer support. Father figures are closer to the child and closer to others in the family. And remaining in the home and maintaining contact with the suspect allows pressures to continue. Okay? So it makes sense, all of these different factors that we found in our research. Now, that of course means that if a child does disclose, we're pretty darned lucky that they're disclosing, but they're not going to disclose forever in many cases unless we give them an interview and if we give them any support that is available, such as family members who might believe the child and who can help the child maintain their story. And I got to be careful the way I say that. I don't mean help the child maintain their story by discussing the abuse over and over again with the child. This is not a coaching issue, but this is an issue where the child feels supported without rehearsal. And if one can capture a convincing narrative, then a recantation is less likely to undermine the case. Okay, so now I'll switch to the case study part, and I just want to quickly review with you the 10-step interview. You're probably familiar with it. It's a modification of the NICHD protocol, and I think protocols around the country are pretty much moving in the same direction. So you tend to see interview instructions are quite common, takes a couple of minutes, and this is where we teach the child that an interview is different than normal adult-child interactions. The adult is actually ignorant. The child is in a position to correct the interviewer. The child is encouraged to say don't know if she doesn't know. She's encouraged to say don't understand if she doesn't understand, and she's asked to promise to tell the truth. Okay. Step 6 is narrative practice rapport building, and this is where we spend 5 to 7 minutes discussing non-abusive events with the child. And the reason why I mention both of these is both of these increase the quality of the information that children produce and increase the productivity of children across the board. And as you'll see, one of the keys to a good recantation interview is to keep the child talking. The more that the child talks, the better able you are to distinguish between a true and a false recantation. And we know that narrative practice rapport building increases the amount of information that children produce. Step 7 is the allegation phase, and this is where you introduce the reason for investigation. This turns out to be not a problem in recanters. In fact, recanters are often very eager to discuss the allegation because they come into the interview wanting to set the record straight. They want to say it didn't really happen. So we find that we can use the same approach to recanters that we use with children who are in active disclosure. Is tell me why you came to see me today works as well. And the other questions work as well. I heard something about your, I heard you talk to a policeman, I heard you talk to a social worker. Those are all good cues for the recanter because the child is able to say, oh, you mean when I lied to the social worker? And then the child is basically telling us about their previous disclosure. And the last 2 steps, or last 3 steps rather, are the open-ended follow-ups that get at individual episodes. Now, as I mentioned already, this is going to be different, right? This allegation phase and this open-ended follow-ups is going to have to be different in the case of a recanting child because the recanting child is not telling you, you know, I was abused on such and such, in such and such a place, and then give you a series of abuse episodes. But what the child can give you is a series of disclosure episodes. And that's the focus I'm going to recommend. Is when you interview a recanting child, you want to focus on prior disclosures. So instead of tell me everything that happened, you're going to want to ask questions like this. Tell me everything that you said to X. And X is the different people to whom the child has previously disclosed. What did X say to you? Because this allows you to determine if the person was asking the child whether the person was biased in any way or whether the person was evoking a disclosure that was more spontaneous and more based on the child's recall. And what did you think when you told the person? Children will often describe their regret at having disclosed to a mandated reporter. And that is significant because a child who is making a false allegation would be happy to tell a mandated reporter. But a child who is telling a true allegation, but who didn't want the authorities to know, is exactly the kind of child who is likely to be falsely recanting. That is a child who is now saying it didn't happen because she didn't want the secret to come out. And you children will tell you that about how they thought when they first disclosed. Now, children tend to take one of 2 strategies, and either strategy in response to these questions are very enlightening. In most cases, we found that children will repeat the allegations. Now, they'll say, but it wasn't true, but it wasn't true. But they will tell you about their prior disclosures. And because if you're doing a good job of interviewing with open-ended questions and you've used narrative practice rapport building, children will be able to give you a context that will allow you to assess the report. That's one strategy. Some kids take the opposite strategy and they deny those prior allegations. Now, that isn't such a great strategy in most cases if the child has disclosed to an impartial person, right? If the child has disclosed, say, to a teacher, and there's no reason to think that the teacher is making it up, then the child now saying, no, I never really actually disclosed to that teacher, proves that, or strongly suggests that the child is now not telling the truth. And it increases the belief that the previous statement, that when she did allege abuse, was likely to be a true report. Okay? So those are the two strategies, and both of those are illustrative and helpful. Now, disclosure history, just knowing about the disclosure history will give us good hints to whether a recantation is more or less likely to be true. It increases the credibility, and when I say credible, I mean that the abuse occurred if the child disclosed to a friend and if the child didn't know it would lead to a report. Because if you think about it, if a child wants to make a false allegation in order to get someone in trouble, they don't tell a friend, they don't ask the friend to keep it a secret, they want it to lead to a report. But if the child is telling the truth when she first discloses abuse, telling it to a friend, asking the friend to keep it a secret, not knowing it will lead to a report, makes it more likely that the abuse actually occurred. Now, I'm not saying that if the child discloses to her mother first, then it's not likely to be true. It's just harder to tell, because then you really want to ask questions about the extent to which there were suspicions of abuse before the child disclosed. If there were suspicions of abuse before the child disclosed, then you worry more about the allegations to begin with, right? Because it's the standard suggestibility issue. But if the child's if the child's disclosure led to the suspicions, then it's more credible, okay? So less credible, child didn't disclose, until after repeated and documented questioning. That would be the suggestibility argument. But if child disclosed and then the suspicions arose, it was like, oh my gosh, that's more credible, all right? Okay, now I'm going to give you an example of a 13-year-old child. 13-year-olds are quite savvy, but this is quite typical. What we do is we, as I said, ask the child, tell me everything that happened, and the child will, in a recantation case, of course, not say that the abuse happened, but they'll start with the disclosure. And then we ask questions about, well, what did you say to your counselor? And here's how Jessica responded. She said that my dad kissed me. Okay, so you said your dad kissed you. Mm-hmm. And what did your counselor say when you said that? That she was going to tell her boss. And then I'm like, no, because I trusted you. And well, like, no, I'm going to still tell her. And then I'm like, wait, I was like, why did I tell you? And then she got mad, and that's all. Well, notice that we already have a clue, because we now know that she did not want the counselor to report the abuse. And that increases the credibility of her original report. Notice, on the other hand, however, that one could argue that the counselor has misconstrued her report, because all Jessica discloses to us is that her dad kissed her. This is one of the reasons why the tell me everything question is extremely important. The interviewer took a break, and we discussed this during the break, and we said, you really want to find out as much as you can about what she is willing to tell you she told the counselor. And this actually worked better than we could possibly expect. So after the break, she says, I just want to go back a little bit. So I want to go back to when we were talking about what you told your counselor when you first told her, okay? So it's really important that I know everything that you said to her. So tell me everything that you said when you told your counselor about what happened. And Jessica responds this way. When I told her about the things that happened. So what things did you tell her? I told her that my dad kissed me and that he touched me where he doesn't supposed to. Notice she's now disclosing that she did disclose abuse. She's actually even saying it really happened, although that's more than you could possibly hope for. And I told her to not tell no one. And then she was like, oh, I'm telling my boss. And I'm like, no, please don't. And then she was like, I will. And then the next time I met her, the next time I saw her, she said that she told her already. And I'm like, I trusted you. So I don't know why you told her. She's redisclosing the fact that she didn't want this reported. but she's now also making it clear that she did in fact tell the counselor about sexual abuse. And again, this increases the credibility of the claim. Okay, now I can tell you, in dependency court, where you don't have a beyond the reasonable doubt standard and where you won't have to have some kind of corroborating evidence, in LA at least, they require all sorts of corroborative evidence, you'd have a tough time with Jessica, right? Because she never acknowledges that she was telling the truth about the abuse. But in dependency, the judge was convinced that she had been abused, and not only had she been abused, but it was clear that she had been subjected to pressures to get her to recant. Let me give you another case study, and this is a situation with a 9-year-old named Monica. Now, Monica's, the backstory is interesting. The mother and father, Ivan, were drinking and playing a question game in which they asked each other questions. The father told her that she needed to be tougher when disciplining the children, and then told her that the child Monica knows how he disciplines her, which prompted the mother to wake the sleeping child and ask what the father meant by the comment that she knows how he disciplines her. And at that point, Monica told her that Ivan, the father, was touching her private parts. The mother reported that once she told the father, Ivan, that she was calling 911 and reporting the abuse, he fled the home and had not been apprehended. Okay, so this is, you know, how flight suggests guilt, so that's a little suspicious. When Monica came to the interview, we actually didn't anticipate that she would recant, but we found out subsequent to beginning the interview that the mother had been reunited with Ivan and was now supporting Ivan. So here's how Monica disclosed. She did initially sound like she was disclosing abuse because she was asked about why she was here, and she said about something bad that my dad did something to me. And the interviewer said, tell me more about dad did something bad. And she says this, that he did like watching some sexy stuff, and he did that to me. But when I tell them over there at the other police station, then it was not sure it was just a dream. I was thinking it was not a dream, but it was. And that's why we can go together, me and my dad. Now, it's a little bit hard to understand Monica because this is her second language she's speaking in. But clearly what she's saying is she's talking about being exposed to some sexy stuff, and she later talks about exposure to porn, which is part of her story. But the other part of the story is that it was just a dream. Then we asked, well, what did you tell your mom? I told her that some of the bad things to me, and my mom said, really? And then I said to her that they put here to my butt and I didn't like it. And then my mom said that, oh, she said that it was your dad? And I said, no. And then my mom told my dad, and then my dad said, no. My mom think he was lying. And then when my dad got mad, they was fighting a lot. And then my mom called the police. Now here, Monica is making it sound as if the mother was pushing her to say that it was the father. But what's extraordinary about this interview, and this even happened during break, where she was rehearsing her story and she was going, no, not my dad, not my dad, is she constantly shifted back and forth between saying it was her dad and saying it wasn't her dad. Okay, and that, of course, is highly revealing. Now, notice that she discloses the abuse, but secondhand. She says, I told my mom they were hurting me. Well, she's saying it's a dream. And we can't challenge her on that. But what we can do is ask for complete details about the dream. Because we can ask, well, is it credible that this was just a dream? And here's how she responded to some of these questions. And these are questions about the dream content. When there was the pee-pee to the butt, what did your body feel? Like hurting. And I felt like it was bleeding, but it wasn't. I feel like it was white and some white stuff come out in the pee-pee of a guy. Tell me more about that. And then I feel like disgusting. And then I just run away. And then I run away, but they got me fast and they did it more and more. So I know earlier you said you were saying to stop, but he wouldn't. She's repeating something earlier Monica said. What did he say? He said, don't tell me to your mom and stay calm. It will not hurt. Just stay quiet. But it hurted. And then he said, I said to stop. But then he was finished doing it. Now we go to the bathroom to take a shower. Now, notice how she's now giving us details of this prior disclosure that allows us to say, is this a detailed report of abuse? It's also allowing us to say, well, is it credible that she might have seen this in pornography? But notice that she is describing certain sexual things that you would see in pornography. But all of this warnings about not telling, all of her talks about body feelings, and all of her talk about him taking a shower afterwards, those are the kinds of things that are more likely to be coming from experience and less likely something that she would have seen if she had been exposed to porn. So that's the first piece of advice, is treat the prior disclosure as the event and ask the child questions about the event, disclosure event. The second piece of advice, and I see that I'm going a little bit over time, so I'm going to give you, I'm going to skip some of my content, but these slides are available and you can read through the content. I want to get to questions. Ask about conversations with interested adults. Ask questions like, what has X said about Y? What has your mom said about your dad? What has your dad said about your mom? What has your mom said about what you said? What has your mom said about what happened? Because you can get at the influences on the child, right? Children will disclose influences. And I don't have time to read everything that Monica said, but basically we were able to establish that it was the father who told her that it was just a dream. And the last piece of advice is to ask about the child's motives. How do you feel about everything that has happened? Kids who are recanting will complain about the changes in their life, about being either removed or losing the perpetrator, right? Because if they're not removed, then the perpetrator has to leave the home. They'll talk about their siblings and how their siblings miss the father. They'll talk about what a good provider he is and how they need him for funds and other things. And these, of course, all provide motives for the child to recant a true allegation. What do you want to happen now? Right? Again, gets at how the child will say, I want him to be able to come back into the home because his kids need him. Where do you want to live until you were a grown-up? This is a question we ask all our children. But of course, this too is a way to get at this issue of why is it that she would recant allegations against this man? And basically, children will often explain their motive for recanting. Now, of course, it is possible that a child is telling the truth now, that they did make a false accusation, and now they're seeing the negative effects of that false allegation. But so often children provide very detailed redisclosures of what they previously have told people that makes that argument implausible. And everything now then just helps to explain why they are recanting a true allegation and not a false allegation. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that I left a little time. I think we have about 13 minutes. Let me just quickly say that if you want copies of any of the papers I've mentioned, the JLG paper I mentioned, the recantation studies, you can easily find them on the internet. You can download them for free. And I'm always interested in hearing from folks about your own experiences with recants and anything else really for that matter, because all the research and work I do is really inspired by the work that you do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyon. Just making sure you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a lot of questions that came through, so I will go ahead and get started. One question that came through in the beginning was, in the London et al. Study, was there an analysis of the different rates of disclosures for male and female victims?
If I remember right, there's a little bit of, I can't remember if London discussed it, but I know there's a little bit of literature on greater reluctance to disclose among boys. And that's related to the greater embarrassment they feel because they're typically subject to molestation by men, and how it's increased embarrassment due to sexual identity issues. And so I have seen some work on that. I can't recall if London endorsed that view. They're very skeptical, by the way, about any correlation between abuse factors and disclosure, but I think that's because they're very suspicious of the abuse literature.
Thank you. Another question that came through, do you find differences in recanting between sexual abuse and exposure to IPV, intimate partner violence?
Oh, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know of any research that's been done on DV exposure. And you know, even the only literature I know, there's a little bit on physical abuse, which finds as high, if not higher, rates of denial and recantation. But you know, I don't know that there's a lot of literature on recantation in exposure to violence. I would suspect you could argue the same dynamics would apply.
And a couple people have posted some things they know in the chat, so make sure you look at the chat, and maybe somebody else here can give you some advice.
Excellent.
So, yeah, a lot of people are typing. A lot of people have some information.
Okay.
Somebody else asked if a child recants and you ask them about prior disclosures and what they said, and then they respond that they never said anything, they deny the whole disclosure. How would you go about handling that?
Yeah, that's that, you know, that's that other strategy I talked about. What you want to do is you want to very patiently, without pushing them hard, you want to say, well, I heard you talk to, and then go through each of the disclosure recipients, each of the persons to whom the child has told, and get the child to say, no, I never told them. Because what you're doing is you're proving that the child is now not being honest. And hopefully, to the extent there's good documentation of what those prior allegations were, and those prior allegations were made to impartial people, then you can rely on those prior allegations to substantiate that the child was in fact abused. And this is something you could even if this were a criminal case, this is the kind of thing you could do in court, because in California and many other states, we could prove up a case through what we call prior inconsistent statements. And the child denying it now makes those prior statements probative evidence.
Thank you. Somebody was asking specifically about the case study with Monica.
Yeah.
Was there any consideration of conducting the interview in the child's native or preferred language?
Yes, that's a good point, and I apologize for our. I mean, I'm in Los Angeles, and I should know Spanish. The reason why we do conduct interviews, even preferably in English, is if the child expresses comfort in speaking in English, and Monica did, and she, as you could see, she was very descriptive, despite the fact that she had some trouble with syntax. It's so much better for the court system, because there are judges, attorneys, I would say most of whom don't speak Spanish. And it would be a really difficult interviewer with an interpreter, because interpreters have such a hard time in matching the rapport and in keeping the questions open-ended. So there are strong reasons why, even though it would be better to interview her in Spanish, English has many advantages as long as the child is comfortable doing so.
Thank you. So this is more of seems like a very legal question. They said, doesn't the fact that the supportive approach to eliciting the narrative of the child call into question the validity of the court tradition of creating an adversary context in a trial to ensure truth?
That is a legal question. Yeah. The interesting thing is the courts don't assume that interviews have to be adversarial. So if she were testifying, then yes, you'd say there should be cross-examination. Although even then, you assume there should be direct examination, and the courts actually acknowledge the fact that in direct examination, it's appropriate to lead a child. So the notion that you can't be supportive is only inconsistent if you're thinking of testimony and if you're thinking of cross-examination. But if you're thinking about an interview, which would come in as a type of hearsay, the courts recognize that supportive, as long as it's not suggestive language, is appropriate.
Thank you. So one person also asked about, could you ask a variant question? For example, how do you feel when you told X? So what do you think about those kind of questions?
That's great. And actually, I think maybe I kind of went over it too fast. Yes. we ask, what did you think when you told? How did you feel when you told? Because as you could see, Jessica revealed how she didn't want it to be reported, and that was highly relevant and useful. Children will express, their fears about the consequences of disclosure, which in fact then often come true. And so you get all the same kind of information that you get from a disclosing child about why we might expect the child's story to be inconsistent or incomplete, or why they might recant.
Thank you. So this is kind of on the lines of the question before about a child then denying the situation, but this says, this person asked, what if in the initial interview, the child discloses, but then goes home, says it's not true, and now the child has come back for a second interview. Do you have any advice on how to proceed in that situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting problem. I mean, because I'm assuming the question is, well, some people say, should you even interview the child if a parent reports that the child is recanted, but you have a complete forensic interview? And I am ambivalent about that. I can see reasons why you might not want to conduct another interview, because you're just rewarding the parent for pressuring the child. And if you have a videotaped interview to begin with, there's no reason for you to re-interview the child. However, if the child disclosed and then went home and recanted, and we don't have a videotape of that initial disclosure, then I think you're in a position where you really do need to interview the child and use the techniques that I've recommended.
Thank you so much. I believe we have one more question, unless somebody else comes on, and I think we only really have time for one more question that was asked in the beginning. So somebody asked, what about a kiddo who makes allegations as soon as she is at the level of someone's follow-up, and then has a history of people not believing her and using her mental health and her history against her, but is also getting herself stuck in this pattern? I'm curious about her thoughts. So somebody who's recanting because of people not believing her in the past.
Oh, and if she can explain it? I think I'm missing something, but that seems like really useful information to suggest a false recantation, right? Is to get her to elaborate on the lacking belief, because that's exactly the kind of lacking support that then leads truly abused children to recant. And so I think that's getting her to elaborate on that is very helpful.
And the person before who asked you about the second interview was piggybacking off of that and said that they, I just lost the question. They conducted a follow-up interview because the parent had videotaped the recant, but once at the interview, she was inconsistent and did not recant, but was inconsistent, I think is what she's trying to say.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, and then yeah.
Yeah. So one of the it's a interesting problem, because one of the things we found in our recantation study, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but a fairly large number of children then re-allege after the recantation. And so it is so another reason why you may want to interview the child is both because the child may re-allege and because the parents or other persons reported the recant is false. So child discloses, parent says, oh, she's recanted, but she really hasn't. And so a re-interview might establish that. I just hate to get into that, you get into that horrible situation where you might be interviewing and re-interviewing. And I could see reasons why you'd want to stop that if you have an initial clear allegation.
That makes sense. There's some other good questions, but I believe we're coming to the end of the time. I want to thank you. And I also want to reiterate that all the events we have coming up with ABSAC, like the certificate series, and that we have a code for the online course if you want to get if you want to get a discount, it's webinar 10. And we have a code today to be an ABSAC member that is Zoom Chat 10. You can save 10% off if you type in Zoom Chat 10. This will all be included in the follow-up email I send everyone with the PowerPoint and the recording of today as well. But I would like to thank everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Lyon.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.